Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LTA North week number 6 overview and analysis video in the spring split. This is kind of the final regular season week. I guess technically, if you really want to go that route, there is one more after this, but that's really a qualification week. That's kind of like a play-in week for the playoffs, so this is really the last round-robin week of the regular season. We're already wrapping that up and getting closer and closer to playoffs. By the end of today's video, we're going to know the two teams from each group that end up auto-qualifying for the upper bracket of playoffs, the top 4 seeds, and we're not going to know the order they're going to be going in just yet because that's saved for next week, but we're also going to be knowing the 4 teams at the bottom of each group that have to kind of fight it out to get into the playoffs. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you think was going to happen this week? Were there any upsets that maybe surprised you? We haven't really gotten a ton of upsets in the LTA, but trust me, this week is definitely one of the most interesting ones, so I'm excited to talk about it, but always curious to know you guys' thoughts and opinions down below as per usual. But let's get into the content, shall we? If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will be updating my personal power rankings, but again, a lot of the end of this video is going to be talking about the standings and exactly where these teams fell, because that's going to determine everything going into next week. So I'm excited. Hope you guys are as well. Let's get into it. No more wasting time at the start of this video. Let's get into day number 1. Of course, as per usual, every single team only plays one best of 3 over the course of the week, but because it's single round robin, every single one of these games matters so much. So kicking it off with what is likely the series of the week in terms of expectations is really fun. It's Cloud9 taking on Team Liquid, kind of fighting it out for that number 1 spot in Group A, and Cloud9 is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 victory. And while this is a 2-0, I don't think it's fair to say that they decimated this series in the same kind of way that maybe the stats would indicate. Team Liquid put up a fight, or more specifically APA put up a fight. I think it's fair to say he had an amazing series, specifically on the Ziggs in game number 2, where he was trying his best to 1v9 on his signature champion. Unfortunately, the rest of his team was just not there for that, and that includes players that have been playing really well, in my opinion, over the past couple of weeks. I think that there is some conversation to be had about Team Liquid that I'm excited to go over, but how can you not talk about Cloud9? This team might be the best team in the LTA right now in terms of their production and their upside, because I do think this team is pretty versatile. I think they have kind of proven that in terms of their results. They were the only team to beat FlyQuest in the best of 1 stage. They just beat Team Liquid for the second time this year. It all just feels really good for Cloud9. It feels like it's all coming together, and I think, again, their playstyle kind of indicates to me that this is not some sort of fluke. I think the players that needed to step up have started to step up. That being said, Cloud9 has disappointed in the past couple of splits, and so there is this sort of hesitancy that's naturally going to be there, trying to predict them moving forward. But right now, this team looks really good, and especially really good in the back half of games, which is definitely not something we always said about them. Player of the series for me might be a bit against the grain, but I'm going to go for Loki in the mid lane. I just thought he played the final fights of game number 2 so gorgeously on the Aurora. I think Blabber is a totally fine choice here. He got to play some carries in this series, which they haven't really indexed heavily into over the past couple of weeks. The Neferi in game 1, the Lilia in game number 2 going into Umpty. They wanted to try to pressure him out in the early game because that's where he struggles the most, and that is where Umpty ended up struggling in this series. But Loki, man, he is just on fire right now. I think when you watch his micro movements in a lot of these final fights, it's just everything you could ask for. I think he's very active as a player in the mid game. I think APA really stepped up here today, and I think you could even argue that APA was the better mid in terms of the laning phase. But man, Loki did such a good job of being able to pressure out Team Liquid in every fight that they needed him to. You know, this might not be the most popular opinion in the world, but Loki to me is the best player on Cloud9 right now, and I do think that he's in the running for MVP. And trust me, we'll talk about the MVP conversation because people did not like what I had to say last week at all, and I'm not surprised. I'm really not shocked to know that it wasn't a popular opinion. It doesn't mean I'm going to change it, but we'll get into that for Team Liquid on the other side. Loki is right up there with anybody for MVP right now in terms of what has happened in the spring split. But Blabber was excellent. One of the things I've kind of been caught saying over the past couple of weeks is that, okay, Blabber's playing facilitators again. He's starting to play a lot more, passive in terms of the early game. He's not throwing away games, and he's just doing the things he does really well and letting his laners win games for him, which I think is what Blabber has always been the best at. I think his Maokai Sejuani, like those kinds of games have always been really consistent. consistent. Now things like Skarner, I think, very much fit the identity for what Cloud9 want to do, because Blabber is so good at setting things up. Like, I'm not trying to say, oh, maybe he's not like a superstar carry type of jungler. No, like, I compare him to, players like Peanut and Tarzan in other regions. Tarzan in particular, I think, is a pretty apt comparison for the playstyle I think Blabber wants to play at a super high-end level, but he can still carry games, and especially if you give him resources early. The Nefiri looked awesome. The Lilia was super clutch in game number 2. Blabber just had a really great series. He's getting his form back. He looks better right now than he really has at any point so far in 2025, and really at any point in 2024, even when I was much higher on him than a lot of consensus was. I think Blabber is starting to get back into MVP Blabber. I'm not saying that he's on pace to do that right now, just because I think Loki has stood out just a tad bit more for me on Cloud9, but he certainly has been great. I think Sven has been the most consistent AD carry in the entire region. I think Thanatos is the most mechanically talented top laner in the entire region. Even when he's on these tanks, it's clear that he just has a better understanding of what to do in the game than someone like Impact does on the other side, which again, we will talk about, and I've already, made my case that Vulcan is the best support in the LTA. Cloud9 is just clicking on all cylinders. I can't stress enough, they found their playstyle that really works for them individually as players, and they are pushing it, and it's really fun to watch. And for Team Liquid on the other side, I'm not giving up entirely on this team, but this does expose some of those flaws that we had been talking about for TL. This isn't a particularly consistent team, and I think that that is the concern. That's why they were number 4 in my power rankings for a bit of time, because I just didn't really know what I was going to get out of this team on a game-to-game basis. But the real issue for me is that you just do not have a top laner at a top-end level. Impact is going to get yet another dead of the series for me. And again, people might give this to Umti because he got blasted in the early game, and trust me, I understand that, but I don't think I've ever seen a more useless game than Impact on Yorick in game number 2, and it's not like he was good at all on Rumble in game number 1. This guy was split pushing every single time and was down like 60 CS. Like, it's completely unacceptable for Impact to be playing this way. I mean this, like, as much as I can possibly say it. If Impact wasn't Impact, if this wasn't a guy who had won multiple championships and had been, a Worlds winner and, is one of the most historic top laners in North American League of Legends history, if he didn't have the brand associated with him, he would have been replaced weeks ago, because this guy is unplayable right now in terms of what he's doing in 2025. There is no positive to his game. He's getting blasted in lane. He's super useless out of lane. He's not a good split pusher. He's not really playing tanks at a high level. Like, the best case scenario for Impact so far this split has been that you can completely ignore him. And just, if that's the case, then that's horrible. Like, that's really not good for a team that's trying to repeat as champions here in the LTA. And that was kind of the case in Winter as well. It certainly was the case at First Stand, where I thought he was the worst player at the entire tournament. It's just not acceptable. Impact is not even a top 6 top laner right now. I would take even players like Fudge over Impact in terms of what's happening, and that just goes to show how bad Impact has been. I really don't think he's doing anything at even an average level. But the thing that got me in hot water last week was calling Umti my favorite to win MVP, and people got really upset at that in the comments. Not maybe really upset. That feels a little bit egregious in terms of maybe the tone of the comments, because I don't think they were that upset. But I want to try and reiterate my point. Umti is not a top 1 jungler in terms of talent in the LTA, but if you are looking at the sample size of the 10 to 12 games that Team Liquid has played across just split number 2, just the spring split, has Umti been incredibly valuable to what this team wants to accomplish? Absolutely. In fact, I don't even think that's really all that debatable. He has been unreal kinds of good for Team Liquid in this small 1-month stretch. I get that the reputation for Umti is not very good, and people highlighted, oh, if he's so good, if he's an MVP favorite, why are they bringing in Yuji? Well, not to peel back the curtain a bit, this move has been in the works for quite a long time, long before Umti started getting into form. This was basically already done before the beginning of Spring Split. They already knew they were bringing in Yuji. They already knew that this was going to be something that they wanted to index into, and they were right to do so, because Umti was a problem at First Stand. He wasn't particularly good there, and I thought he was a problem in the Winter Split, and to me, he was this team's biggest issue last year as well when they were trying to push to be the best team in North America. It just so happened that the moment they brought in Yuji, Umti started to play the best league he's played. That being said, we know this guy is super streaky. That's what he was in the LCK, and so to see him kind of crash back down to earth here, maybe that good form has run out, and maybe Umti will now be a player that goes back to being what he used to be, but I'm not going to sit here and pull back and say, oh, I was wrong about saying Umti was an MVP favorite. If you just want to look at the 10 to 12 game sample size, the 6-week sample size of the regular season here in North America, Umti has been the most valuable player in that small size when you talk about the best of 1s and the best of 3s, and even even if that doesn't continue towards the end of the split, it's just what my opinion was. He just got out jungled in this one. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense, but also worth noting, LYON and Core got blasted in this series. They were not relevant, and LYON has been significantly worse in spring than he really ever has been, ever since breaking out, especially in 2024. Like, maybe you could compare this to 2023 LYON, but I was way higher on 2023 LYON than, like, whatever the form is right now. Maybe he just needs some time to lock in a little bit, but the laning stats are not looking nearly as dominant as they normally are. He's not generating as big of leads. APA had to single-handedly salvage this series as much as possible, and he tried his best. In fact, I considered him for player of the series because he was that valuable to Team Liquid. It just did not end up mattering. They end up falling, and to me, this secures their spot at number 3, and Cloud9 is a top 2 team in the LTA, again, until proven otherwise. I didn't put them above Fly, even though they beat them, because I just trust Fly's roster a little bit more, but if Cloud9 was the team that ended up winning the LTA North and representing the region at MSI, reminder, you only get 1 representative from North America at MSI because it's 2 from the LTA, not 2 from the LTA North. So if Cloud9 ends up being the team that wins spring and represents the region internationally, I'm not going to be surprised at all. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and boy, did we finally get an upset here in the LTA. It's 100 Thieves taking on Shopify Rebellion, and somehow, some way, Shopify Rebellion are going to take this series 2-1. They're going to pick up a big victory here because, let me remind you, this is a very tense group situation. 100 Thieves have already lost to the number 1 team in their group, which is, of course, FlyQuest, and so Shopify picking up this win gives them and 100 Thieves the same record, and Shopify has the tiebreaker between the two, which is ginormous. I don't think anybody expected that. If things go as expected on day number 2 with FlyQuest beating Dignitas, which we will obviously talk about, Shopify's second in this group. They make playoffs over 100 Thieves, at least from a guaranteed perspective, and they get slotted into upper bracket. That's how ginormous this victory is for them. I can't stress enough. This is everything that this team was looking for and then some. They're finally starting to live up to some of that potential we were hoping for, and then for 100 Thieves on the other side, this is disaster. I mean, truly disaster. Like, you cannot, like, stress how bad this is for 100 Thieves. This is worst case scenario in every single way. A team that at times looked like they would be top 2 in North America, made finals in the winter split. They have crumbled and they have disintegrated in terms of what their expectations are. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For Shopify, player of the series, to me, it's gotta go to Fudge. Like, how can you give it to anybody that isn't Fudge in terms of the team fighting in this series? I get that Contracts did so much work in the early game, and trust me, I acknowledge how good Contracts was, and he deserved player of the series as well if you wanted to give it to him. Palafox was incredible on the Xerath in game number 3. Really felt like a counter pick, right? I know sometimes we talk about these off-meta counter picks that end up showing up as like answers to specific meta threats, but like the Xerath felt unbeatable for the Azir on the other side, which we will talk about. Seos played the Milio beautifully. This is somebody who I've criticized in the past for not being able to play enchanters, for exclusively playing engagers, and B-Boy was pretty good as well. Like, Shopify showed up, but Fudge was that guy. And honestly, I'm not even taking full other opinions on this. I think he is player of the series. If you want to tell me that he played a single team fight here not perfectly, I just don't know if I agree with you on that. Every single 5v5, Fudge absolutely dominated, and this is something we've talked about before on the channel, and we've talked about in the comments section as well, where it's like, okay, Fudge going up against someone in Sniper who he believes he's better than, yeah, now all of a sudden he's able to do fine in lane, generate some leads even on tanks, and then be super useful in team fights. He just has to have that confidence that he can play up and aggressive, and we've seen that kind of dwindle, we'll just say, over the course of the past year or so, but when it's there, it still works incredibly well. This is the Fudge factor that almost won him an MVP a couple of years ago, so credit to Fudge. I thought he looked excellent on the Scion and especially on the Gnar in game number 3, but again, like I said, it was the whole team here. I want to give a big shout out to Palafox in the mid lane for that Xerath counter pick. Sometimes teams can get a little bit set in their ways and not be willing to look for innovation. This is a gigantic series. Like, this is a big game number 3 in particular, and Palafox having the, I guess, wherewithal and the confidence to go for a counter pick like Xerath in this game and really dominate it, you know, being able to just survive all of the pressure put into him in these team fights coming in from Nocturne, diving the backline, and Aurelia diving the backline, and still be super useful here. It's just incredible stuff. I thought this was one of his better series of the year. Seos was really good, like I said, on Milio. Contracts was the early game, like, creator for Shopify. Every single thing in this early part of the game kind of ran through him, which is obviously exactly what you're looking for. And B-Boy, even if he was the player player that stood out the least for me when it came to Shopify in this series was still very consistent, and especially in Game 3 on that Lucian, to have the Milio there to facilitate a lot of the rest of this game was incredible. I think Shopify just played awesome across the board. Obviously, dropping game number 1 is expected against a team like 100 Thieves because they were supposed to lose this series pretty handily, but this is ginormous. This was the team that was supposed to be way better, easily the best of the rest, like better than LYON, better than Dig, better than Disguise. Like, they were supposed to be the team that sat clearly at number 5. They have not been that throughout this year, but this might be the win they need to catapult themselves into that conversation. And for 100 Thieves on the other side, again, I can't stress enough just how disastrous this is for them individually as a team, because now you're looking at a situation where you probably aren't going to be getting into the upper bracket of the playoffs. You are kind of expending your extra life for the playoffs, if you will, here, and that's presuming that you actually do still qualify for the playoffs. As a reminder, and this isn't set in stone yet, we'll talk about this later on as we get into the standings, if 100 Thieves is going to be bottom 2 in the group, they have to play a best of 3 to qualify for the playoffs. 3 games determine whether or not your split can continue, and even then, if you win that, you still auto go into the lower part of the bracket. Like, your lower life is still expended. So this could be a disastrous loss for 100 Thieves, and they have no one to blame but themselves. They really underperformed today. They got outplayed across the board. The only player that I think you could even give some credence to is FBI, but he picked Smolder in game number 2. No wonder this team ended up losing. You played Smolder, Nidalee, Renekton. Like, I just don't understand what the idea was behind this. And then in game 3, they just got completely outplayed. And it's actually going to be Quid who gets my dud of the series. I think some people might go a couple of different directions for this. Sniper is a pretty obvious choice. I think even River or Ayla would also be relatively obvious choices. But man, dude, that Azir was useless in game number 3. And I get that the counter pick ended up coming through for Palafox, and that's a big reason why, but this is your MVP caliber player getting completely outplayed by one of the worst mid laners in the entire league in a game that could determine whether or not you have any sort of chance in the playoffs. This is unacceptable from Quid, and he deserves dud of the series. Again, go watch that game number 3. It's not like he was good in game 2 on the LYON either. It's not like that was pushing him forward. This wasn't just a one-game problem. Quid was not good in this series, and that's a real concern because he is a gigantic part of why this team is good in the first place. In fact, I would argue he is the reason this team is good, and so if he's getting outplayed, they are doomed. But Sniper got outplayed on the top side. It felt like his run of form had been pretty good as of late, and that did not continue. Fudge was the better top laner by far. River did not have nearly the pressure Contracts had, even in the early game on the Nidalee in game number 2, but on the Nocturne, he couldn't dive anybody on the backline. The only target was Xerath, and Xerath was just surviving every single one of these engages and fights. Ayla was kind of useless, but it wasn't entirely his fault on some of these engaged champions. It just was a bad look for 100 Thieves, and now they are sitting in a spot where they don't control their own destiny. Actually, I think now that I think about it, I think they're locked in to bottom 2, because even if Dig wins later, so if Fly wins, then Shopify is at 2, 100 Thieves is at 3, and Dig is at 4. If Dig wins, Dig gets the number 2 spot, and then Shopify gets 3 and 100 Thieves gets 4. I think this loss mathematically eliminates 100 Thieves from being able to move forward, I believe. If not, obviously, leave me a comment on that down in the comments. Not that it matters. We'll find out by the end of the week, but I believe this loss is that detrimental to 100 Thieves, and they could have just thrown away all the goodwill they had spent a ton of time building up. And for Shopify, like I said, you can't overstate how big this is. They put themselves in a prime position to automatically qualify for playoffs and keep that extra life to be a top 4 seed going into playoffs, which is just absurd for this team and what their expectations were. They've not been consistent at all, but all it takes is one win, one overperformance, especially in a format this congested, and that's exactly what they gave. But then moving on now to day number 2, and this is the series that we were just talking about that's going to determine a lot here. It's FlyQuest taking on Dignitas, and Fly is going to pick up the expected 2-0 victory. This means that Dig, unfortunately, will be last in their Group B, but what this does confirm is that with that victory in the previous series, Shopify Rebellion is guaranteed to be number 2 in Group B. They will be in the playoffs. They're a top 4 seed. They will be playing to potentially get the number 3 seed next week against Team Liquid, which is a very interesting matchup now. But again, we'll preview all that later. Let's talk about FlyQuest versus Dignitas, because, while this series is interesting in the sense that it broke down the rest of what we can expect from the playoffs, it's not particularly interesting in terms of how we ended up getting there. So we'll go ahead and talk about it now. Player of the series for me is going to go to Busio in the support position. And I'm going to be honest, I've kind of been dying on the Hill for a little while. Quid's been a player I've really pushed. Loki, I think, has been a player I've pushed for MVP. Is Busio the MVP of the split? Like, are we just overlooking this? Are we making this more difficult on ourselves? To me, he's easily been the best player on FlyQuest so far in spring. I think Bwipo has made an argument. I think that there are people that would go to bat for Inspired, but for me, Busio has kind of been the guy, and is he the most valuable player to his individual team right now? He's leading the LTA in player of the series in terms of the things that I personally track, and, you know, of the metrics that I track that I don't release here, that I keep a little bit closer to the chest just to, you know, perfect some of the formulas that I've got going on, he grades out incredibly well there as well, right up there with Vulcan in terms of a top 2 support, if not number 1. He's ahead in a couple of key statistics, and so, you know, Busio might be the MVP right now, and he's just continued to be a gigantic playmaker for this team. He had an awesome game 2 on the Alistair, really looked awesome in that one, and, you know, created a lot of opportunities. He was way better than Isles on the other side. Nico has been a huge pick for him and for FlyQuest across this entire year, so overall, just impressed with Busio, continue to be excited about his development, and I will continue to say that I think he's playing the best he ever has right now, especially at a tier 1 level. But I do want to give a big shout out to Bwipo. I think he got the broadcast player of the series. He gets a lot of those, mostly because he's a very popular player, but this time I do think it's at least a little bit more deserved on the Nidalee in game number 1. That's really the one that I think you'd be giving him the player of the series for. Nidalee top has been slowly growing in popularity over the past couple of weeks. We've seen it really kind of take off in the LPL and in the LCK. Players like the Shy and Zeus really committing a lot of resources into playing this basically every series with differing results, we'll just say. We saw it played in the NACL this past week as well, but Bwipo ends up making it work here. I think he just trusts that he's going to be way better than Surdy. The thing that Nidalee does at an incredibly high level is get a 50 CS lead and then not really do anything the rest of the game. And so, you know, you can use that and that can be valuable. And, you know, Bwipo was very valuable in game 1, was still very valuable in game 2 on the Galio as well. But most of what he's getting player of the series for on broadcast, I imagine, is that Nidalee game. Inspired, Masu, Quad, they were all solid. Quad had some moments where he was a bit more up and down. Azir has not looked all that consistent across this week. Kind of funny to be able to say that considering just the identity of that champion in general, but FlyQuest was never in danger in this series. They were better than Dignitas by a large margin. They go undefeated in the group stage, and they're going to be fighting it out with Cloud9 to get that number 1 seed going into playoffs. And then for Dig on the other side, they just don't have the talent to be able to compete with FlyQuest. I don't think anybody was surprised by this outcome really in any facet. Isles is going to get my dud of the series, but man, could this go a couple of different ways. Surdy could get it. Hell, even Shaden could get it, but I think a lot of people are either going to give it to him or not because of that post-game interview. I'm not going to touch upon it too much. I'm just going to give my thoughts in saying that this isn't a disaster. This isn't like, oh, this is why LTA viewership is declining. Let's be real, man. Like, there are so many great personalities in the LTA. If you want to focus on Shaden being a little bit worse of an interview, which, by the way, I think has helped his brand 10x, but if you want to focus on Shaden being a slightly worse interview and completely ignore the fact that we have Bwipo, we have Inspired, we have APA, we've got all of these players, Busio, that have done such a great job of being ambassadors for North America, then whatever, man. Like, at that point, it's kind of up to you. Like, it's on you to kind of say that I'm ignoring the ones who are very good at this and just kind of focusing on the ones that are not very good. But Shaden also got out jungled here, so if you just want to focus on the gameplay, I do kind of understand it. But Isles, to me, stood out as like the one who was the most outclassed, and I think most of that was because Busio was so good on the other side that Isles kind of felt more negative. At this point, we kind of know who Isles is as a player. I don't think he's a bad player. I just don't think he's a particularly great player. He's going to be a slightly below league average support at this level, somebody who hovers around being the 6th best support in the region at any given time. There are worse things to be than that, but he's never going to be a star, and especially when he goes in to someone like Busio, who I think is kind of playing out of his mind right now, it's more exposed that he has some negatives towards his game, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. I honestly considered giving this to Kana in the mid lane because, boy, did he play that Sylas game awfully, but he was okay in game 1 on the Victor, so I kind of went away from that. But overall, Dig losing this isn't particularly surprising. Again, it doesn't matter that they're last in the group. They still have an opportunity to be able to earn their way into playoffs with a series next week. I believe that one, you know, we'll find out who they're playing by the end of this next series, but, you know, Dig still has a chance to be able to potentially get top 6 with Shopify kind of leaping them in terms of the priority list. It definitely becomes a bit more difficult, but you never can count anybody out, and this team has some interesting pieces. I just don't think they're very consistent. And then for Fly on the other side, this is still, as far as I'm concerned, the best team in North America. They're going to get a chance to prove that next week, fighting it out for the number 1 seed against Cloud9. Whoever wins, that's going to be the team to beat going into playoffs, and I'm excited to see if that's going to be Fly. But then moving on to our final series of the week and our second series of day number 2, and it was a matchup between LYON and Disguised, where LYON predictably is going to pick up the 2-0. I say predictably as if either of these teams are definitely good. I think LYON has kind of proven who they are at this point, and I'm just a little bit lower on them than I think consensus is always going to be. I think what we have seen so far out of this team is that they are really good at beating people that they are just more mechanically talented than. Specifically, Saint is really good at taking over these games against teams like Disguised, where they can just completely outskill their opponents. But when they go up against teams that are as good as them in terms of the mechanics and, have, like the top 4, I'll just simplify. When they go up against the top 4, they look inept in those matchups. They don't look nearly as good as they do in the lower matchups. They don't even really look all that competitive. So that's just my take on LYON. I think this team is still probably around number 5 in terms of the power rankings, but this is not a shocking win. Disguised has been disastrous across this year, and to see Saint take over in a matchup against the weakest mid laner in North America, nobody should be surprised by that. So let's go ahead and get into it. Saint is going to be my player of the series. I see a lot of people being like, man, Saint's dominated this split. Why is Saint not in the MVP conversation? It's because he's completely run it against the actual good teams. Like, yes, if you look at his matchups against the bottom 3 teams in the LTA, then you can definitely make the argument that he should be an MVP. In his matchups against those teams, his 5 series against those teams, he has run every single matchup there, and it's looked really good for him, and he's able to completely outskill his opponents. But when he's gone up against the upper tier teams, oftentimes he's a big reason why his team is losing in a lot of those instances. I specifically think his late game team fighting has a lot it needs to work on, but when he is able to go into Abadaga and get these ginormous leads in the mid lane, just dominate the 1v1 and really start to pressure out other teams, then yeah, things look a lot better in that regard. Saint right now is still just all mechanics, no brain, and that's okay. Like, we've seen that out of players at this level before. That's what Quid was on 100 Thieves in his first split, and he grew into a player that I think was a lot more valuable than that because they put the right players around him and the right infrastructure around him to be able to develop him. I think Saint can be the best mid laner in North America, but do I think Saint is the best mid laner in North America? Absolutely not. I don't think he's there quite yet. I just think it'll take him a bit of time, but he has been very good, especially against talent that's nowhere near the same kind of mechanical level that he is at. I do also want to give a shout out to Licorice. The guy started game number 2 down like a ridiculous amount of CS, 0 and 3 on the Jace, and ends up being super useful in the back half of that game. That's one of those where you give him the honor after it because you just, GG, stayed cool. Like, it's all cool for Licorice. He's had some ups and downs, but so is Castle on the other side of this matchup. So no real surprise to see that Licorice at least has the ability to take advantage of this. It's just nice to see that it's even possible. I do also want to give a shout out to the LATAM players here, ODLAN and Lions, in terms of how they ended up playing in this series. I feel like we've talked about them very little across the spring split. We talked about them a lot in winter because ODLAN was horrible for this team and Lions looked like the worst support in the league. I don't think they've looked tremendously better. ODLAN has definitely stepped up a bit more as an early game presence and put a lot more attention on trying to get mid lane into a good position, which is generally, I think, what Lion needs to do. But outside of that, they've been fine. I think this was a series where it's like, yeah, they're better than their counterparts. XU has really struggled to do anything at the tier 1 level, and He certainly is not in great form right now. Henna was also fine. I'm certainly not trying to take anything away from him, but Scary Jerry was definitely the best piece on Disguised in this series, as he has been throughout the entirety of the spring split, and so it kind of took a little bit of the edge off of Henna playing a good Ashe game, if you will. But Saint continues to be the driving force for LYON in their wins. When he's good enough to outskill the enemy team, this team is not really going to have a ton of trouble winning games. When he's not quite at the level where he can just out-mechanic everybody, they might struggle a bit more. It's pretty one-dimensional in that regard. And then for Disguised on the other side, they just don't have the talent to be able to make this work. Abadaga has been the least valuable player in the LTA. He has graded out to me across this split being the worst player in North America, and honestly, I think at this point there's just no justification for running it back for him in summer. I know it's going to be difficult to try and acquire a mid laner because, again, I think that there are teams like, Dark Zero that probably don't want to be giving up their mid laner, but, especially if Dark Zero wants to go for their secondary roster a bit more, wants to play Dark Zero Light a bit more commonly like they did in the last week here of the regular season in the NACL. If someone like Spyrax is available, I think he would fit this team rather well, but I don't know, like, is there an upgrade here that would immediately make Disguised good? Probably not, but Abadaga is just too bad right now to be playing in the league. His laning is some of the worst I've seen out of a mid laner in a major region in a very long time. He does not even look remotely competent at this level, and again, he's graded out easily as the least valuable player, the worst player in the LTA North across 2025. I think it's also worth noting that Castle has just completely fallen off the map. I have no clue what happened to him as a player. He was so good in winter, and it feels like he has completely given up in spring. There's always been talent there. I really liked him in the Challengers League. Maybe not really liked him, but I thought that there were some interesting traits in the Challengers League, and that's just not really translated even after the Immortal stint here to Disguised. Back-to-back years where he's on the worst team in the league, I'm sure has taken a moral, it's definitely probably broken his determination, we'll just say. XU is the worst jungler in the league. He just doesn't really have anything going for him. He's only good with good lanes, and right now his lanes are losing, and so he doesn't really do anything. I know that feels harsh, but it just kind of is the reality. Jerry is trying his absolute best to carry these games, and it just is not happening. He is getting better game over game, as he has done every single game his entire career at every level he has played at. I think this is a guy who can make a difference at a tier 1 level. This is not the team that it's ever going to happen on. Disguised is the worst team right now in the LTA, and that has only become even more clear as we've watched more games. But LYON, of course, with this win, gets themselves 3rd place in the group. This was just fighting it out for, spots, and, obviously it's going to be really big for LYON to be able to pick up that win over DSG, because 100 Thieves is now sitting in 3rd place on the other side. You don't want to be the team that's sitting in 4th that has to go play 100 Thieves in a best of 3 to qualify for playoffs. So LYON definitely going to feel pretty relieved to not have to do that, and especially if Saint can continue to pop off and show that mechanical talent, this team's going to be fine. I just don't know if they're ever going to be world beaters. All right, but that is going to do it for my LTA North week number 6 overview and analysis video, and kind of the last week of the regular season. I know that feels like a weird way to talk about it, but groups are over. You can see up on the screen the final group standings after week number 6. Of course, the second part of the regular season here, the first part being that round robin best of 1. The groups kind of being determined because of that, but now we have a good idea of where these teams are going to fall. You can see my personal power rankings to the right of every single team. No real major changes except for Shopify leapfrogging Dignitas with their win, kind of getting them into the playoffs. But the big thing to take away here, the number 1 and number 2 teams in each group have qualified for the playoffs, guaranteed. We don't know the seeding quite yet. That will be determined next week from these teams, but Cloud9, Team Liquid, FlyQuest, and Shopify Rebellion are the first 4 teams to qualify for the playoffs. Definitely not expected there from these teams. LYON, Disguised, 100 Thieves, and Dignitas will have to play their way in, but that transitions us well into the cross-group matchups for next week, kind of talking about the format and how things work from this point onwards. Like we said, Cloud9, FlyQuest, Team Liquid, Shopify Rebellion, they are already in the playoffs, but now they are playing for seeding. As a reminder, this is a double elimination 6-team playoff bracket where the top 4 teams are slotted into upper bracket, number 5 and 6 are slotted into lower bracket, and then we just get double elimination from that point onwards. So should be pretty familiar to a lot of North American fans, but we get our seeding matchups, Cloud9 and FlyQuest playing for the number 1 seed. Whoever wins that gets the 1 seed. The loser gets the 2 seed. Team Liquid and Shopify playing for the 3 and 4 seed respectively, but they are in the upper bracket no matter what. It's all just about seeding at this point. Our elimination matches on the other side of this are number 3 in each group versus number 4 in the opposite group. So LYON, because they got number 3 in Group A, will face Dignitas, the team that got 4th in Group B, and vice versa. 100 Thieves taking on Disguised in order to qualify themselves for the playoffs and to be the teams that end up getting the number 5 and 6 seeds. Of course, the projected winners are LYON and 100 Thieves. I don't even think I really have to explain why. I think they're pretty big favorites in these series. If anything else happens, that would be a pretty big upset. I think Dignitas is much more likely to beat LYON than Disguised is to beat 100 Thieves, but that's just my personal opinion. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with on that take down in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 6. Player of the week for me, it's going to go to Busio, the support for FlyQuest. This guy has just been on fire so far in 2025. I think he's having the best year of his entire career, specifically because he's been unlocked as a playmaker. I think Nico coming into the meta has really helped him because this is a perfect champion for how he likes to play the game. Really can pop off, pun not intended, on those teamfight ultimates in the late fights, but the Alistar was also excellent in Game 2 against Dignitas. He was my choice for Player of the Week, and he's kind of leading the MVP conversation right now with FlyQuest being the team I have at the top of the standings. My honorable mentions, Saint, the mid laner for LYON. I know I kind of talked him down a little bit more in the segment in particular, but he was excellent against Abadaga and against Disguised. I just think low level of competition, how much does that translate? But I'm certainly not trying to take anything away from the actual performance itself. If you wanted to give Saint Player of the Week, I honestly kind of agree with that in terms of him being the most dominant player in his individual series, but, you know, right now he's my number 2 option for this week. And then Fudge, the top laner for Shopify Rebellion, he was so good in those team fights for Shopify in such a gigantic win. To me, it was pretty obvious that he was an honorable mention for Player of the Week, but those are going to be the positives. Let's talk about my dud of the week, which is going to go to Impact, the top laner for Team Liquid. At this point, I've basically completely given up on Impact. He's been arguably one of the 5 least valuable players players in North America, full stop, not just of like top tier teams or in terms of what the expectations are. Every single time Team Liquid loses a series, you can almost always point to Impact as being the problem in that series. And I just hate to continue to point it out, but this narrative of like his first year on a new team is always good, and then every year after that, it just subsequently gets worse. It continues to kind of permeate throughout his career, and it's really frustrating to be able to say that, but he is easy. He's an easy choice, in my opinion, for Dead of the Week here in week number 6. I guess if you wanted to give it to Abadaga, I also kind of understand that because he got rolled, but I think Impact was honestly less effective in his matchup. So Impact is going to get my Dead of the Week, and Busio is going to get my Player of the Week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LTA North season next week when we talk about the seeding and elimination matchups, and then of course the playoffs are right around the corner. We're also covering all 3 of the other major regions, so LEC, LCK, and LPL every single week on this channel. Playoffs are around the corner for them as well, so stick around for those. We also cover the NACL, as I've talked about a couple of times in this video, and playoffs are starting for them as well, Tier 2 here in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all